An orphaned millionaire saw an elderly homeless woman who looked identical to his deceased mother, crying in the rain. When he approached, the old woman said something that brought him to tears. The rain fell heavily on the city that Friday night, transforming the streets into dark rivers that reflected the lights of lampposts and cars rushing by. Rick drove his imported car through the busy avenues, with the windshield wipers working at maximum speed to see the path ahead. He was a 45-year-old man, tall, broad-shouldered, with black hair beginning to turn grey at the temples, wearing an Italian suit that demonstrated his position as a successful businessman. His brown eyes were tired after another long day of meetings in his office, where he ran one of the largest technology companies in the region. Rick sighed deeply and thought to himself, "Another empty day. When did my life become just work?" The traffic light ahead turned red, and Rick slowed down, stopping the vehicle while distractedly observing people running in the rain. They were hurried, anonymous faces, each with their own lives and problems. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, impatient to get home, take a hot shower and try to sleep. Isabel, his wife, would probably already be in her separate bedroom, as had been happening lately. Their marriage had become a cold routine, without real conversations, just formalities during breakfast and silent dinners. Rick turned off the radio that was playing softly and muttered to himself, "How did I reach this point in life?" The light turned green and Rick drove forward, turning right toward the upscale neighborhood where his mansion was located. The rain intensified, and he slowed down, having difficulty seeing through the windshield even with the wipers at maximum. The streets were almost empty at that hour, with only a few cars circulating on the main avenue. Rick was thinking about his agenda for the next day, the meetings he would have, the contracts he needed to sign, when something happened so quickly that he barely had time to process it. A dark car sped through the intersection ahead, completely out of control, and Rick heard a sound that made his blood freeze. He shouted alone inside the car, "What the hell was that?" That's when he saw it. A human figure was lying in the middle of the street, a few meters ahead, illuminated only by the weak light of a nearby lamppost. The car that had passed at high speed had disappeared into the darkness, its taillights vanishing around the next curve. Rick felt his heart race as he stepped on the brake, quickly parking on the side of the road. He didn't think twice before opening the door and running out into the torrential rain, feeling the cold water soaking his suit in seconds. His leather shoes hit hard on the wet asphalt as he ran toward the fallen person, and all he could think was that someone needed urgent help. Rick thought hurriedly, "I need to see if they're alive. I need to do something." When Rick approached the fallen figure, he saw it was an elderly woman, dressed in worn clothes completely soaked by the rain. She was lying on her side, motionless, and Rick felt a tightness in his chest, thinking she might not be alive. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her shoulder carefully, trying to gently turn her to check if she was breathing. It was at that moment, when the yellowish light from the lamppost illuminated that woman's face, that Rick felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He was completely paralyzed, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing, as he whispered in disbelief, "No, this can't be happening." The homeless woman's face had a disturbing resemblance to his mother. It wasn't identical, at least Rick tried to convince himself of that, but it was frighteningly similar. The shape of the face, the delicate curve of the eyebrows, the way the nose curved slightly upward. Rick felt his breathing falter, his heart beating erratically as he studied every feature of that aged and dirty face. His fingers trembled violently when he pushed away some white hair strands stuck to the woman's forehead, revealing a small wound. He shook his head, trying to push away the crazy thoughts that were beginning to invade his mind, trying to convince himself that he was just too tired, too stressed. Rick thought in panic, "I'm seeing things. It's just fatigue, the rain, the dim light." But the more he looked, the more the resemblance disturbed him. There was something in that face that awakened deep memories, sensations he couldn't name. Rick felt tears burning his eyes, but he didn't know if they were tears of fear, confusion, or a crazy hope that he refused to admit. He touched the woman's neck, looking for a pulse, and when he felt the weak but present beat, he sighed in relief. She was alive. Rick took off his soaked jacket and placed it under her head, protecting her a bit from the rain and the cold asphalt. His hands were still shaking as he searched for his cell phone in his pants pocket. He muttered to himself, "I need to call for help. I need to stop looking at her like this." Other cars began to stop, and some people approached asking what had happened. Rick could barely form coherent sentences to explain, his voice coming out trembling and distant. He said something about a hit and run, about a car that fled, but his words seemed to come from far away. A man offered his coat to cover the elderly woman, and Rick accepted with a vague gesture. His eyes fixed on that face he couldn't stop studying. Every small detail seemed familiar and strange at the same time. There was a small mark near her left eye that made Rick's heart race even more, because his mother had a mark exactly in that spot. But this was just coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Rick thought desperately, many people have birthmarks. This doesn't mean anything. Someone said they had already called an ambulance, that it was on its way. Rick nodded without really hearing, all his attention focused on the unconscious woman. He noticed the torn and dirty clothes, the kind of clothes people living on the streets wore. Her nails were broken and dirty, her hair tangled and unkempt. How could someone like this have any connection with his mother, who had always been so elegant, so careful with her appearance? Rick forced himself to breathe deeply, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to suffocate him. He held the woman's cold hand, feeling the rough and calloused skin so different from the soft hands he remembered from his childhood. He whispered softly, "Who are you? Why does your face haunt me like this?" The rain began to diminish, but Rick didn't even notice. He remained there, kneeling on the wet ground, holding the hand of that stranger who carried the ghost of his dead mother. His mind was at war with itself. The rational part screamed that this was impossible, that his mother had died 5 years ago, that he was at the funeral, that he signed the documents, that he saw the coffin. But there was a small, irrational, desperate part inside him that whispered, what if? What if there had been a mistake? What if she had been alive all this time? Rick shook his head violently, pushing away these dangerous thoughts. He thought firmly, she's dead. This is just a cruel coincidence of fate. In the distance, the sound of the ambulance siren began to approach, and Rick felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The paramedics could help that woman, they could save her. But at the same time, a part of him feared the moment when they would have to take her away, when he would have to let go of that hand and let her go. He looked at her face again, memorizing every detail, every wrinkle, every strand of white hair. Why was he doing this? Why couldn't he simply accept that she was a stranger who needed medical help? Rick gently squeezed the cold hand he was holding and murmured, "Hang on now, please hang on until help arrives." The ambulance finally parked nearby, its red and blue lights spinning and illuminating the entire scene with a surreal glow. 2 paramedics quickly jumped out, bringing equipment and a stretcher. They approached asking quick and professional questions about what had happened, how long she had been unconscious, if she had said anything. Rick answered mechanically, explaining about the hit and run, about the car that fled. The paramedics began their work efficiently, checking vital signs, placing an oxygen mask, immobilizing her neck with a cervical collar. One of them gently asked Rick to step back a little, but he was reluctant to let go of her hand. He looked at the paramedic and said, "Will she be okay? Please, tell me she'll survive." The paramedics assured that they would do everything possible, but that they needed to take her to the hospital immediately. Rick finally released the woman's hand and stood up, giving them space to work. He was completely soaked, shivering from cold, but felt nothing beyond a deep anguish that he couldn't explain. Why did this stranger matter so much to him? Why did he feel as if he was losing someone precious again? When the paramedics began to lift the stretcher, Rick stepped forward and said urgently, "I need to go with her. I can't let her go to the hospital alone." It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. The woman's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the bright lights around her. She seemed completely disoriented, lost, her eyes wandering unfocused for a moment. Then, as if guided by some deep instinct, her eyes found Rick's face. There was a second of total silence, a moment suspended in time where nothing else existed beyond those 2 gazes meeting. Rick felt his heart completely stop when he saw those dark brown eyes staring at him. There was something in that look, something familiar and impossible at the same time. that made all his rational defenses crumble. He thought in absolute shock, "Those eyes. I know those eyes." The woman tried to speak, her lips moving with difficulty. Her voice came out weak, almost inaudible, but Rick was close enough to hear every word. She looked directly into his eyes, and something in that gaze carried a depth of emotion that cut through Rick like a blade. Her words came out slowly, separated, carrying a weight he couldn't comprehend. The woman whispered so softly that only he could hear, each word falling like a stone into a deep lake. "My little prince, always protect your heart." The entire world disappeared. Rick felt as if he had been struck by lightning. Those words were impossible. That specific phrase was a secret, a sacred ritual that only his mother knew. Since he was a child, every night before sleeping, she would say exactly those words. Even when he was already an adult, in moments of farewell, she whispered that phrase as a protection, as a blessing. No one else in the whole world knew those words. No one. Rick felt his legs weaken, his entire body beginning to shake violently. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. His mind screamed that it was impossible, that there had to be an explanation. But his heart recognized something that reason refused to accept. The woman closed her eyes again, her head falling to the side on the stretcher. The paramedics sprang into action immediately, checking her vital signs with renewed urgency, saying they needed to go now, that she was very weak. Rick stood paralyzed, completely unable to move or speak. Tears streamed down his face mixed with the rain, and he didn't even notice. One of the paramedics touched his shoulder, asking if he was okay, if he knew the woman. But Rick couldn't form words. How could he explain the impossible? How could he say that an unknown homeless woman had just repeated the most intimate and secret words of his dead mother? Finally, something broke inside Rick. All the confusion, all the fear, all the desperate hope that he had tried to suppress exploded out in a scream that tore through the night. He grabbed the side of the stretcher with both hands, his hands trembling so much he could barely hold onto it. His face was wet with rain and tears, his eyes wide in a mixture of terror and hope. The paramedics tried to calm him, but Rick heard nothing beyond the sound of his own heart beating erratically. He looked at the unconscious face of the woman and shouted with all the strength he had, his voice echoing through the empty street. Rick screamed desperately, "Hurry up, save her, she said, it can't be that, my God, it can't be real." The ambulance cut through the rainy night with its strident sirens, and Rick was sitting on the side bench, unable to take his eyes off the unconscious woman lying on the stretcher in front of him. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her vital signs, adjusting the IV that dripped slowly through the tube connected to her arm. The fluorescent light inside the ambulance illuminated the pale face of the elderly woman, revealing every wrinkle, every mark of time, and Rick felt as if he were in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. His hands trembled uncontrollably on his knees, and he squeezed his fingers tightly, trying to concentrate, trying to find some logic in the chaos his mind had become. Rick thought anguishedly, "My little prince." How could she know those words? One of the paramedics looked at Rick with concern and asked if he was okay, if he needed anything. Rick shook his head negatively, unable to form words at that moment. He wanted to explain that he wasn't okay, that nothing was okay, that his entire world had turned upside down in the last 20 minutes. But how could he say that to a stranger? The paramedic turned his attention back to the patient, and Rick continued his silent vigil, observing her every movement, every shallow breath that made her chest rise and fall slowly. He murmured softly, "I need to know the truth. I need to understand what's happening." The ambulance finally arrived at the municipal hospital, entering at high speed through the emergency ramp. The rear doors opened quickly, and a medical team was already waiting outside. Rick jumped out of the ambulance and followed behind the stretcher as they rushed down the corridor, passing through automatic doors that opened with a metallic sound. Bright fluorescent lights rapidly passed above his head as he tried to keep pace with the medical team. A nurse tried to stop him from following, saying he needed to wait in the waiting room, but Rick completely ignored her, continuing to walk behind the stretcher until two security guards held him by the arms. Rick said desperately, "Please, let me stay. She needs me." The security guards were firm but gentle, escorting Rick to the waiting room while explaining that the doctors needed to work without interference. Rick finally stopped resisting, allowing himself to be guided to an uncomfortable plastic chair in the hallway. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands, feeling the weight of that impossible situation falling on his shoulders. The corridor was quiet at that hour of dawn, with only a few people scattered in other chairs, each wrapped in their own concerns. He whispered to himself, "Hang in there. Whoever you are, please, hang in there." The minutes dragged on as Rick waited, each second seeming like an eternity. He constantly looked at the clock on the wall, watching the hands move with torturous slowness. His suit was still damp from the rain, sticking uncomfortably to his skin, but he hardly noticed. All he could think about were those words, that impossible phrase that kept echoing in his mind without stopping. He tried to find rational explanations, tried to convince himself that there was some logical reason for all of this. Rick thought in confusion, "I'm going crazy. There's no other explanation for this." 40 minutes later, a young nurse appeared in the corridor carrying a transparent plastic bag with some objects inside. She looked around until her eyes found Rick and walked toward him with quick steps. Rick immediately stood up, his heart racing as she approached. The nurse stopped in front of him and asked if he was the person who had brought in the lady who was hit by a car. Rick nodded quickly, and the nurse extended the plastic bag to him, explaining that they were the patient's personal belongings. Rick took the bag with trembling hands and asked, "How is she? Please tell me something." The nurse gave a reassuring smile and said that the doctors were doing everything they could, that the situation was delicate but that she was being well cared for. She walked away, leaving Rick alone with the plastic bag in his hands. He returned to his chair and sat down slowly, looking at the contents through the transparent plastic. There was very little there, just the sad belongings of someone living on the streets. An old torn bag made of faded fabric, some loose coins, a piece of bread wrapped in a dirty napkin. He thought sadly, nobody deserves to live like this. Nobody deserves to end up alone on the streets. With trembling fingers, Rick opened the plastic bag and removed the torn fabric bag. It was light, almost empty, and he opened it carefully, as if handling something sacred. Inside were the few things he had already seen, plus some crumpled papers that appeared to be old receipts. Rick slowly went through the contents, not knowing exactly what he was looking for. That's when his fingers touched something different at the bottom of the bag, something thicker than paper. He carefully pulled out the object and felt his heart stop completely when he saw what it was. He whispered in shock, "No, this can't be real." The photograph showed a sunny garden, with colorful flowers in the background and a large tree whose branches extended over the scene. And there, sitting on a wooden bench, was a young and beautiful woman with dark brown hair and a radiant smile. She held in her arms a small boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, who looked at the camera with large, curious eyes. Rick knew that photo. He remembered that day, remembered that tree, remembered that garden that was in the old house where they lived when he was still a child. That woman in the photo was his mother, Eleanor, young and happy. And that boy was him. He turned the photo over and saw something written with faded blue pen on the back. "My little prince, my reason for living." Rick's hands were trembling so violently that he almost dropped the photo. Tears began to stream down his face as he stared at that image from the past. That was his mother's handwriting. He recognized every curve of the letters. But how was that photo with an unknown beggar woman on the streets? His mind tried to find rational explanations. Perhaps the woman had found the photo somewhere. Perhaps someone had thrown away old belongings. But that didn't explain the words she had whispered, didn't explain the look of recognition. Rick pressed the photo against his chest and thought, what's happening? Who is this woman really? Rick carefully tucked the photo into the inner pocket of his still damp jacket, feeling its weight against his heart. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he couldn't let that photograph leave his hands. It was the only clue he had, the only concrete thing amid that sea of impossibilities and confusion. Anxiety was eating Rick from the inside, making each minute feel like an hour. He muttered impatiently, "I need to know. I need answers now." Finally, after 30 more minutes, the double doors opened and a doctor came out. removing the disposable gloves from her hands while looking around the hallway. She was a middle-aged woman, with graying hair tied in a ponytail and tired eyes that revealed many hours on duty. When her eyes found Rick, she walked toward him with measured steps. Rick ran to meet her, stopping only a few centimeters away. Before she could even speak, he was already asking questions in a flood of jumbled words. The doctor raised a hand and said, "Sir, take a deep breath and let me explain the situation, all right?" Rick forced himself to be quiet, although every cell in his body was screaming for immediate answers. The doctor glanced at her clipboard quickly before returning her tired eyes to Rick. She explained that the patient had suffered injuries in the hit and run, including a head contusion and some bruises throughout her body, but nothing that put her life at immediate risk. The bigger problem was her general health condition. The woman was debilitated after years of hardship, and the doctors were working to stabilize her, which made any recovery much more difficult and risky. The doctor looked directly into Rick's eyes. "To be honest with you, sir, she's in critical condition. We don't know if she'll make it." Rick felt his legs weaken, and he had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. She could die. That mysterious woman could die before he discovered the truth. He looked at the doctor with pleading eyes and asked if there was anything that could be done, any treatment. The doctor explained they were doing everything possible, that she was receiving intravenous fluids and medication to stabilize her vital signs. But she needed rest, and all they could do now was wait. Rick took a deep breath and said, "Please, doctor, do everything you can. She might be important." The doctor looked at him with curiosity and asked if he knew the patient, if he was a relative of hers. Rick hesitated, not knowing how to respond. Did he know her? He didn't know that beggar woman, but at the same time he felt an inexplicable connection. He finally said that he found her after the accident, that he wanted to make sure she would be all right. The doctor nodded with understanding and said Rick could go home to rest, that they would call if there was any change. Rick shook his head vehemently. "I'm not leaving. I need to stay here until she wakes up." The doctor seemed to want to argue, but saw the determination in Rick's eyes and just nodded. She said he could wait there in the hallway. Rick thanked her, and the doctor slightly frowned, as if remembering something. She consulted her notes again and said there was something curious. The woman had regained consciousness for a few seconds while they were stabilizing her. The words didn't make much sense to the medical team, but she thought she should mention it. Rick felt his heart race. What did she say? Please, tell me exactly. The doctor looked at her notes, where she had quickly scribbled the words. She read aloud, trying to reproduce what had been said. The patient had whispered something that sounded like, "Don't let, no, I'm alive." She tried, and then she had fainted again, not completing the thought. The doctor looked at Rick and asked if that made any sense to him. Rick stood completely still, processing those fragmented words. Don't let who know she's alive? Who tried what? What did that mean? His mind was working frantically, trying to find meaning. He looked at the doctor. "I have no idea, Stu. I don't understand any of what this means." But something about those words deeply disturbed him. There was a tone of fear in them, of urgency. Don't let her know I'm alive. This implied that someone believed she was dead, or should be dead. And that she tried sounded sinister, dangerous. Tried what? To hurt her. Rick felt a chill run down his spine as the implications began to take shape in his mind. If that woman really was his mother, if by some impossible miracle she was alive, what had happened to her? Why was she living on the streets? And who would this she be who had tried something terrible? Rick thought disturbingly, this is getting scarier and scarier. The doctor saw the concerned expression on Rick's face and asked if he was okay. Rick shook his head, thanking her for the information. He said he would stay there waiting, that he wanted to be present when the woman woke up. The doctor nodded and said she would notify the nursing staff. She walked away down the corridor, leaving Rick alone again with his turbulent thoughts. He returned to the plastic chair and sat down heavily. It was all too much to process, too impossible to be real. But the photo in his pocket was real, the words were real, the resemblance was real. He muttered, "What are you hiding? Who is trying to hurt her?" Rick took the photo out of his pocket again, looking at that image from the past under the fluorescent light of the corridor. He ran his fingers over his mother's face in the photograph, over his own child's face, trying to understand how that object had ended up in the hands of a homeless woman. His mind was in total chaos. How could his mother be alive? How could she be living on the streets? What had happened during all that time? And those mysterious words about someone not being able to know she was alive, about someone having tried something. He thought exhaustedly, I need answers. I need her to wake up and tell me the truth. The corridor grew even quieter as dawn approached. Rick remained there, awake, his mind spinning endlessly. He held the photo in his hands, looking at it as if it could reveal its secrets by the sheer force of his gaze. Don't let who know. Who was she? What had this mysterious person tried to do? Each question generated 3 more, and none had answers. Rick rested his head against the cold wall and closed his eyes for a moment. He whispered into the emptiness, Mother, if it really is you, what happened to you all these years? The morning light entered through the windows of the hospital corridor, bringing with it the movement of a new day. Rick still sat in the same uncomfortable plastic chair where he had spent the entire night, his eyes red with fatigue, fixed on the double doors through which they had taken the mysterious woman. His suit was completely dry now, but wrinkled and stained, his hair disheveled and stubble shadowing his face. He hadn't slept a minute, his mind spinning endlessly between the impossible words the homeless woman had whispered and the photograph that burned in his pocket as proof of a truth he couldn't accept. He thought exhaustedly, I need to talk to her. I need to hear the truth from her lips. It was then that he heard the sound of high heels echoing down the corridor, a familiar sound that made Rick automatically raise his head. Isabel walked toward him with elegant and measured steps, wearing an expensive and perfectly coordinated outfit, her long dark hair falling impeccably over her shoulders. She carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee and had a carefully constructed expression of concern on her beautiful made-up face. Isabel stopped in front of him and tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes studying her husband's tired face. She said in a soft voice, Rick, love, you didn't come home last night. I called several times, but you didn't answer. I was worried. Rick took his cell phone from his pocket and saw that it was off, the battery completely drained. Isabel extended one of the coffee cups to him, and Rick accepted it mechanically, feeling the heat of the liquid through the paper cup. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and felt the caffeine begin to work in his exhausted system. Isabel sat down in the chair beside him, crossing her legs elegantly. She asked with false concern, What happened, Rick? Why did you spend the night here at the hospital? Rick took another sip of coffee before beginning to speak, his voice coming out hoarse with fatigue. He told her about the hit and run he had witnessed the night before, about the elderly woman who had been abandoned on the street. Isabel listened attentively, her face showing all the appropriate expressions of shock and compassion. But when he got to the part about the woman's face, about the disturbing resemblance to his dead mother, Isabel went completely still. Rick said with a trembling voice, Isabel, I know this will sound crazy, but that woman, her face is exactly like my mother's. Isabel maintained her carefully neutral expression, but a flash of panic quickly passed through her eyes. She gave a light, forced laugh, placing her hand over Rick's. Isabel said in a reassuring voice, Rick, love, you're exhausted. You've overworked this week, slept little, and now you've been up all night. Our minds can play tricks on us when we're this tired. I'm sure this poor woman just vaguely resembles your mother. Your mother died 5 years ago, you know that. But Rick shook his head more forcefully, pulling out a yellowed photograph from the inside pocket of his jacket. His hands trembled as he held the image under the morning light, showing it to Isabel. Rick said with growing urgency, It's not just the resemblance, Isabel. This photo was in her bag. Look, this is me as a child, and this is my mother. How would an unknown homeless woman have this old photograph of my family? And there's more. She said something to me, something only my mother knew. Isabel took the photograph from Rick's hands, and for a fraction of a second, something changed in her face. Her skin visibly paled, her lips tightened into a thin line, and her fingers gripped the photo more tightly than necessary. She recognized that image immediately. It was the same photograph she had seen years ago in Eleanor's house, the same one that the old fool carried like a treasure. How had that photo survived? How did Eleanor still have it, after everything Isabel had done. Isabel thought in silent panic, "Impossible! I got rid of her. How is she still alive?" But Isabel was a consummate actress, trained in hiding her true emotions. In less than 2 seconds, she regained complete control. She studied the photograph with seemingly casual attention before returning it to Rick, shrugging. Isabel said in a calm, rational voice, "Love, this is an old photo. It was probably in some album you donated to charity years ago, or that was thrown away. Homeless people often dig through trash looking for valuable things. She must have found this photo somewhere. It's a disturbing coincidence, I admit, but just a coincidence." Rick wanted to believe her, but something didn't fit. He put the photo back in his pocket and looked directly into Isabel's eyes. Rick said in a low but firm voice, "It's not just the photo, Isabel. When she was lying in the street before she passed out, she opened her eyes and looked right at me. And then she said exactly this: 'My little prince, always protect your heart.' Those were the words my mother said to me every night before I went to sleep. No one else in the world knew that phrase. How could a stranger know?" Isabel felt her heart dangerously accelerate, but kept her face perfectly composed. Those words were impossible. They were a nightmare becoming reality. Eleanor was alive. Somehow, against all odds, the old woman had survived, and now she was there, capable of destroying everything Isabel had built. But Isabel hadn't gotten where she was by being careless. She touched Rick's face with false tenderness. "Rick, you're scaring me now. These words, this fixation, this isn't normal." Rick slightly pushed her hand away, his frustration growing. He abruptly rose from the chair, starting to pace back and forth in the corridor. Isabel watched his every movement with calculating eyes. She needed to act carefully now, needed to control him without appearing to be controlling. Rick stopped and turned to Isabel. He said with conviction, "I'm not imagining things, Isabel. I know what I heard. I know what I felt. I need to talk to her when she wakes up. I need to find out who she really is." Isabel realized she needed to change tactics. She softened her expression, letting genuine concern appear in her eyes. She touched his face again, this time more gently. Isabel said tenderly, "All right, love, I understand that you need to do this for peace of mind. But look at you. You've been up all night. You're exhausted. You haven't eaten anything. Why don't you go home, take a shower, rest for a few hours? I can stay here and wait. If the woman wakes up, I'll call you immediately. I promise I'll take care of her." Rick hesitated, clearly torn. Isabel saw the hesitation and pressed her advantage, intertwining her fingers with his. She said in a soft voice, "I know how important this is to you, love. That's precisely why you need to be at your best when you talk to her. Go home, rest. I'll take care of everything here. You trust me, don't you?" Rick looked into Isabel's eyes, seeing only concern and love reflected there. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he really did need to rest. He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of exhaustion. Rick finally nodded. "All right, but you promise you'll call me the second she wakes up?" Isabel smiled, a beautiful smile that didn't reach her eyes. She lightly kissed Rick's forehead. Isabel said firmly, "I promise, love, the second she opens her eyes, you'll be the first person to know. Now go, take a taxi and go home to rest. Trust me, okay?" Rick nodded again and walked slowly toward the hospital exit, turning one last time to look at Isabel. She was standing in the hallway, waving with an encouraging smile. Rick returned the wave before passing through the automatic doors. Isabel kept the smile on her face until Rick completely disappeared from view. Then, the exact second he left, her smile instantly died. Isabel's face transformed completely, all masks of kindness melting away to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. Her dark eyes gleamed with anger and determination as she looked at the double doors. She walked to the reception with decisive steps. Isabel stopped in front of the nurse on duty and asked in a sweet voice where the hit-and-run patient was. The nurse checked the computer and provided the room number. Isabel thought coldly, "Finally. I'll finish what should have been finished 5 years ago." Isabel walked confidently through the corridors, easily finding the room at the end of a less busy hallway. She paused in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath. She pushed the door gently and entered the room, closing it behind her with a definitive click. The room was silent, Only the sound of the heart monitor breaking the quietness. And there, on the hospital bed, was Eleanor. Isabel approached the bed slowly, her eyes studying the fragile form of the woman. Eleanor was unconscious, her face pale and thin, white hair spread across the pillow. Tubes and wires connected her body to various machines, and she looked so small, so fragile. For a moment, Isabel almost felt pity. Almost. But then she remembered everything that was at stake, everything she would lose if Eleanor woke up. Isabel thought with cold determination, "You should already be dead. You shouldn't have survived." Isabel leaned over the bed, her face just inches from Eleanor's unconscious face. She studied every wrinkle, every mark that the difficult 5 years had left. Isabel knew Eleanor couldn't hear her, but felt the need to speak. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper, loaded with venom. Isabel said slowly, "You should have really died, old woman. I thought I had gotten rid of you forever, but you survived. You were always too stubborn. But don't worry, dear mother-in-law. I'll fix that mistake now." Days had passed since Rick found the homeless woman on the street, and Isabel had worked with impressive efficiency to take total control of the situation. She talked to the hospital doctors using her natural charm and her full wallet, convincing them that the patient would receive much better care in a comfortable home than in a crowded hospital. Isabel hired a private nurse, a young and inexperienced woman who was impressed with the generous salary offered, and arranged a private ambulance to transport Eleanor to the mansion. Rick had been surprised by his wife's sudden kindness, but also grateful that she was willing to help this mysterious woman. Isabel smiled sweetly at him, while supervising the installation of medical equipment in the guest room, saying with false compassion, "If she really means something to you, love, then I'll take care of her as if she were family." Rick's mansion was huge, with 3 floors and more rooms than 2 people could use. The guest room where Eleanor was installed was on the 2nd floor, a spacious room with large windows overlooking the garden. The private nurse, a young woman named Karen, set up all the necessary equipment and established a care routine. Eleanor remained semi-conscious most of the time, her eyes occasionally opening but without real focus, her words coming out confused and disconnected. Rick visited the room several times a day, sitting beside the bed and holding her cold hand, waiting for the moment when she would fully awaken and could answer his questions. Isabel observed each visitor with calculating eyes, her mind constantly working. She thought coldly, "I need to keep her quiet until I figure out how to get rid of her permanently." Early in the morning, Isabel waited patiently until Rick left for work. She watched him through the window as he got into his car and drove out the gate, his taillights disappearing around the bend of the tree-lined street. As soon as he was out of sight, Isabel went up the stairs with determined steps to the guest room. Nurse Karen was sitting in a chair next to the bed, reading a magazine while occasionally checking the patient's vital signs. Isabel entered the room with a professional smile and said she needed to have a private conversation with the patient about delicate family matters. Karen hesitated, saying she shouldn't leave the patient alone, but Isabel pulled out a generous amount of money from her purse and held it out to the nurse. Isabel said firmly, "Take the rest of the day off, dear. Come back tomorrow morning. I'll take care of the lady myself today." Karen looked at the money and then at Isabel, clearly tempted. The salary was already good, but that extra money represented almost a month's work. She took the bills with hesitant fingers and agreed, saying she would return early the next day. Isabel maintained her smile until the door closed behind the nurse and she heard the footsteps going down the stairs. Then slowly, her smile completely disappeared. She turned to the bed where Eleanor was lying, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and regular. Isabel walked to the door and locked it from the inside, turning the key in the lock with a metallic click that echoed through the silent room. She thought with dark satisfaction, Finally I can say everything I've kept inside for 5 years." Isabel approached the bed with slow, measured steps, her high heels sinking slightly into the thick carpet. She pulled the chair where Karen had been sitting and positioned it next to the bed, sitting down with her legs elegantly crossed. Eleanor didn't move, but Isabel noticed the slight tremor in her eyelids, the sign that she wasn't completely unconscious. Isabel leaned forward and spoke in a low but clear voice, each word loaded with poison and accumulated resentment. Isabel began slowly, savoring each word. "Hello, Eleanor. I know you can hear me even if you can't open your eyes or respond. The medications I'm giving you keep you in this pleasant, drowsy state, conscious enough to hear, but unable to react. Perfect for our little chat, don't you think?" Eleanor tried to open her eyes, her fingers slightly contracting on the white sheet, but her body didn't fully obey her commands. Isabel observed the weak efforts with cold satisfaction. She continued speaking, her voice gaining a tone of barely contained anger as she began to reveal everything she had kept inside. Isabel said with growing bitterness, "You're probably confused, wondering how you ended up here, in your son's house. Let me refresh your memory about the last 5 years, since I know the drugs I used erased much of it. 5 years ago, you discovered I was embezzling money from the company. You were always so observant, always so meticulous with those damn accounting books. I worked so hard to cover my tracks, but you were too smart for your own good." Isabel rose from the chair and began walking around the room, her hands gesturing as she spoke, releasing years of pent-up resentment. She stopped near the window, looking at the sunny garden outside before turning to Eleanor again. Isabel continued in a louder voice, almost shouting now, "You came to me that night, remember? Said you were going to tell Rick everything, that you would report me to the police, that you would take away everything I had achieved. As if you had any right. I married your son, gave years of my life to this family, and you wanted to throw me out on the street like garbage. But I wasn't going to let you destroy my life, Eleanor. Not at all." Isabel returned to the chair beside the bed, leaning so close to Eleanor that she could feel her faint breath. Her eyes shone with a mixture of triumph and cruelty as she continued her confession. Isabel said in a low, dangerous voice, "So I did what I needed to do. That night I put sleeping pills in your tea. You drank it all, trusting me as you always did. How naive. When you passed out, I drugged you with something much stronger, something that would erase your memory. Then I forged death documents, bribed the right people, and organized a fake funeral. Rick cried so much that day, it was almost touching. He really believed you had died in an accident. And you, well, I put you in a car, drove for hours to a distant city, and left you on some street without documents, without money, without anything. I thought you would die in days. But you survived, didn't you? Stubborn to the end." Eleanor made a strange sound in her throat, something between a sob and a moan. Tears began to trickle from the corners of her closed eyes, wetting the white pillow. Isabel observed the tears with indifference, without a trace of remorse on her beautiful face. She took a tissue from the bedside table and roughly wiped the tears from Eleanor's face, as if cleaning an annoying stain. Isabel continued speaking, her voice assuming an almost casual tone. 5 years you spent on the streets, Eleanor. 5 years lost, confused, not knowing who you were. And I lived here in your former home, spending the money I stole, sleeping in the room next to your son. It was perfect, until you had to show up again, had to survive the impossible and find Rick by sheer coincidence. How unlucky for me." Isabel opened her expensive purse and took out a small box with several syringes and medicine vials. She placed everything on the bedside table with careful, deliberate movements. Eleanor managed to open her eyes in narrow slits, seeing through the drug-induced haze the collection of syringes. Her heart raced in panic, making the heart monitor beep faster. Isabel looked at the monitor with irritation and said with false sweetness, "Ah, so you're paying attention now? Great. Let me explain what's going to happen from now on. These medicines here will keep you in a permanent state of confusion. You'll be conscious sometimes, but never enough to form complete sentences or make sense. When Rick comes to visit you, you'll look like a senile old woman with brain damage from the hit and run. Eventually, he'll lose hope that you'll get better. And then, well, accidents happen to fragile patients, don't they?" Isabel took one of the syringes and a vial, carefully filling it with the transparent liquid. She tapped the syringe to remove air bubbles, a professional gesture that revealed she had practiced this before. Eleanor tried to move her arms, tried to scream, tried to do anything, but her body remained heavy and unresponsive. Isabel administered the medication, keeping Eleanor in a state of semi-consciousness. While slowly pushing the plunger, she continued speaking in an almost friendly tone. "Don't worry, this won't kill you. Not yet. For now, it will just keep you quiet and confused. I can't risk you telling Rick the truth. So you'll stay like this, in this pleasant state between sleep and wakefulness, until I figure out the best way to get rid of you permanently." The drugs began to take effect almost immediately. Eleanor's eyes, which had managed to open a little, began to close again. Her mind became even hazier, her thoughts dispersing like smoke. Isabel removed the syringe and threw it in the medical waste bin in the room. She put the other vials and syringes back in her purse, cleaned up any evidence of her presence, and unlocked the door. Before leaving, she leaned over Eleanor one last time and whispered, "Sleep well, dear mother-in-law. Tomorrow we'll continue our conversation. I have so much more to tell you." Isabel left the room with light steps, gently closing the door behind her. She descended the stairs with a satisfied smile on her face, only to find Carol, the maid who had worked in the house for more than 10 years, standing in the entrance hall with a strange expression on her face. Carol was a 50-year-old woman, short and sturdy, with graying hair always tied in a tight bun. She had worked for the family since before Rick got married and knew every corner of that house. Carol looked at Isabel with suspicious eyes and asked where Nurse Karen was. Isabel casually replied that she had given the young woman the day off, that she herself would take care of the patient today. Carol frowned, but said nothing, just nodded. Isabel thought irritably, "This old woman has always been too nosy." That night, when Rick returned from work, he immediately went up to the guest room to visit Eleanor. Isabel accompanied him, standing at the door with a carefully composed expression of concern. Rick sat in the chair beside the bed and took Eleanor's hand, speaking to her in a low, gentle voice. To his delight, her eyes slowly opened. Rick leaned forward with renewed hope, squeezing her hand. He said urgently, "Can you hear me? Please try to talk to me. I need to know who you are." Eleanor tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to form words. Her tongue seemed too thick, her brain too slow to connect thoughts to sounds. Finally, with enormous effort, she managed to whisper something that sounded like, "Rick, be careful. She..." But the words came out so slurred and confused, they were almost incomprehensible. Rick leaned even closer, asking her to repeat, but Eleanor just shook her head weakly before her eyes began to close again. Rick looked back at Isabel with frustration and concern. He asked, "Why is she so confused? The doctors said she was getting better." Isabel entered the room and placed a comforting hand on Rick's shoulder. She said with a sad and concerned voice, each word a perfectly constructed lie, "Love, I spoke with the doctors today. They said she may have suffered more serious neurological damage from the hit and run than they initially thought. Sometimes it happens this way. The patient seems to be improving and then the after effects appear. The poor woman may never fully recover her ability to speak or think clearly. It's very sad, but we need to accept that possibility." Rick felt tears burning his eyes. All his hopes of discovering the truth, of understanding who this woman was and how she knew his mother's words, seemed to be crumbling. He held Eleanor's hand more tightly, as if he could transfer his own strength to her through touch. Isabel watched everything with hidden satisfaction, knowing her plans were working perfectly. Later that night, after Rick had gone downstairs for dinner, Carol quietly climbed the stairs. She had spent the entire day troubled by something she couldn't identify, a feeling that something was wrong. Carol had keys to all the rooms in the house and used one of them to discreetly open the guest room door. She entered silently, looking at Eleanor's sleeping form in the bed. That's when she saw something that made her heart race. In the medical trash beside the bed, there were several used syringes. Many syringes, more than a nurse would normally use in a single day. Carol thought with alarm, "What is Isabel doing to this poor woman?" Carol returned to her room on the ground floor of the mansion and took out a small notebook she kept in her drawer. She began to write down everything she had seen, with date and time. The syringes in the trash, the absence of the nurse, the confused state of the patient, Isabel's insistence on being alone with Eleanor. Carol didn't know exactly what was happening, but her instincts from decades of working in family homes told her something was very wrong. She carefully wrote every detail in her notebook. Carol muttered to herself, "I need to protect this lady, but how do I do that without evidence?" That same night, Carol waited until Isabel was alone in the kitchen preparing tea. She entered nervously, closing the door behind her. Carol wiped her hands on her apron and said with a trembling but determined voice, "Ms. Isabel, forgive my intrusion, but I'm concerned about the patient in the guest room. I saw that you dismissed the nurse today and noticed there were many used syringes in the medical trash. Are you administering medications without professional supervision? Perhaps we should call the doctors to evaluate." Isabel turned slowly from the sink where she was washing her hands, her eyes narrowing dangerously as she stared at Carol. The air in the kitchen turned icy, tense. Isabel dried her hands on a towel with deliberately slow movements before walking over to Carol. She stopped a few inches from the housekeeper, her intimidating height and posture making Carol instinctively step back. Isabel said in a low, threatening voice, "Carol, you've worked here for many years, so I'll be clear just once. What I do or don't do with that woman is none of your business. I'm following medical orders to the letter. If you continue spreading lies and insinuations about me, I'll have to talk to Rick about your continued employment in this house. It would be a shame for you to lose your job after so many years, wouldn't it? Especially at your age when jobs are so difficult to find." A week had passed since Carol tried to confront Isabel about the medications. The housekeeper had backed down in the face of threats, but continued observing everything from afar, noting every detail in her hidden notebook. That Tuesday morning, something unexpected happened. Isabel had made a crucial mistake in calculating the dosage of the drugs she was administering to Eleanor. The previous night's dose had been less than necessary, and when the morning sun came through the guest room windows, Eleanor woke with a surprisingly clear mind for the first time in days. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the soft light that illuminated the elegant room. She looked around, vaguely recognizing the place, remembering confusing fragments of conversations and faces. Eleanor thought with effort, "Where am I? I need to talk to Rick." Eleanor tried to sit up in bed, her weak muscles protesting after days of lying down. She managed to prop herself up against the pillows, her breathing quickened from the effort. Her hands trembled as she looked at the tubes connected to her arm, at the monitor beside the bed. Memories began to return slowly, like pieces of a puzzle fitting together. She remembered the accident, remembered seeing Rick's face, remembered being in the hospital. And then she remembered Isabel, that cold and cruel voice talking about drugs, about keeping her quiet, about what she had done 5 years ago. Eleanor felt tears fill her eyes as everything came back with painful clarity. She whispered to herself, "Isabel, it was her. She took me away from my son." It was at that moment the door opened, and Rick entered the room carrying a tray with hot porridge and orange juice. He had developed the habit of bringing breakfast to Eleanor every morning before going to work, even though she rarely managed to eat. When Rick saw that Eleanor was sitting up with open and focused eyes, his face lit up with joy and hope. He quickly placed the tray on the dresser and rushed to the bed, sitting on the edge and taking her hands. Rick said with an emotional voice, "You're awake, really awake. Your eyes are clear. Please try to talk to me. I need so much to know who you are." Eleanor looked at the face of the son she hadn't seen in 5 years. He was older, more tired, with worry lines marking his forehead and around his eyes. But he was still her Rick, her little prince. Tears rolled down her face as she squeezed his hands with all the strength she could gather. She opened her mouth to speak, fighting against her tongue, still somewhat heavy from the drug residues. Eleanor managed to say with a weak but clear voice, "Rick, my son, it's me, your mother, Eleanor, Isabel. She did terrible things to me. You need to know the truth." Rick felt as if the world had stopped spinning. That voice, even weak and hoarse, was his mother's voice. Those eyes, now lucid and filled with tears, were the eyes he remembered from his childhood. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. He held Eleanor's face with both hands, looking deeply into her eyes. Rick said with a trembling voice, "Mom, is it really you? But how? They said you had died 5 years ago. How is this possible?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, to tell everything about Isabel, about the drugs, about the 5 lost years. But at that exact moment, the bedroom door opened again, and Isabel entered. She stopped immediately upon seeing Eleanor sitting up and talking to Rick, her eyes wide with shock and panic. For a fraction of a second, her face showed pure fear before she regained control. Isabel walked quickly to the bed and said in a loud, concerned voice, "Rick, what's happening? The patient shouldn't be sitting up like this. She could have a relapse. Let me call the doctors immediately." Eleanor tried to continue speaking, tried to tell Rick about Isabel, but the presence of her cruel daughter-in-law made her hesitate. Isabel took advantage of the hesitation and began adjusting the pillows behind Eleanor with abrupt movements, while discreetly grabbing a syringe she always kept in her coat pocket. Eleanor saw the syringe, and her eyes widened in terror. She grabbed Rick's shirt and said with growing urgency, "Don't let her. Don't let her give me medicine. She's poisoning me, making me confused. Rick, please." Rick looked confused from Eleanor to Isabel, not understanding what was happening. Isabel maintained her expression of professional concern and said calmly, "Rick, love, you see? She's delirious again. It's exactly what the doctors warned could happen. She's having hallucinations, paranoia. I need to administer the sedative the doctor prescribed for moments like this. It's for her own good, so she doesn't hurt herself." But Eleanor didn't let go of Rick, her nails digging into his shirt with desperation. She shook her head violently and screamed with all the strength she could muster, "No, she's lying. I am your mother, Rick. Eleanor. She drugged me 5 years ago, faked my death, abandoned me without memories. She was stealing from the company and I found out. Don't let her give me more drugs, please." Rick was completely paralyzed, his brain struggling to process the words. Isabel took advantage of the confusion and gripped Eleanor's arm firmly, trying to insert the syringe. Eleanor fought, trying to pull away, and Rick finally reacted, positioning himself between the two women. He said firmly, "Isabel, stop. Don't give her anything now. I need to understand what's happening first." Isabel backed off, hiding the syringe again. She took a deep breath, quickly reorganizing her thoughts. She touched Rick's arm gently and said in a sad voice, "Rick, I understand that you want to believe her. I know how much you wish your mother was still alive. But look at her objectively. A confused homeless woman we found on the street, who clearly suffers from mental problems. She might have heard you talking about your mother at some point and now, in her delusional state, believes she is Eleanor. It's a tragic situation, but it's not real, love." Rick looked at Eleanor, studying every feature of her face. There was something in those eyes, something that deeply touched his heart. But Isabel also made sense. How could his mother be alive after 5 years? How could all this be possible? He was about to speak when his phone rang. It was his assistant, reminding him of the business trip to another city that would start that afternoon. Rick had completely forgotten. It was 2 days of important meetings that couldn't be cancelled. He looked at Eleanor and said, "I need to travel for work for 2 days. But when I get back, we'll resolve this. We'll do tests, we'll discover the truth. Okay." Eleanor felt absolute panic. If Rick left her alone with Isabel for 2 days, she knew she wouldn't survive. She tried to hold on to him again, but the residual drugs in her system began to take effect, and she felt her strength draining away. Isabel smiled internally, knowing exactly what she needed to do. She hugged Rick and said, "Go on your trip, love. I'll take care of everything here. When you return, everything will be resolved." As soon as Rick left the mansion for the airport, Isabel acted with frightening speed. She dismissed Nurse Karen again, locked Carol in her room on the ground floor using the excuse that she was sick, and returned to the guest room. Eleanor was semi-conscious on the bed, too weak to resist. Isabel administered a heavy dose of sedatives and waited until Eleanor was completely unconscious. Then, with calculated coldness, Isabel dressed Eleanor in old clothes, disconnected all the medical equipment and carried her to the car through the mansion's back exit, where nobody could see them. Isabel thought determinedly, "This time there will be no mistakes. You will disappear forever." Isabel drove for more than an hour until reaching the outskirts of the city, where the streets became emptier and buildings more sparse. She knew this area well, as she had conducted shady business there before. At the end of a dirt road surrounded by dense vegetation, there was an abandoned building that was once a nursing home. The place had been closed for years, its windows broken and walls peeling, but the structure was still solid. Isabel parked the car in front of the building and sent a message to a man named Peter, a watchman she had previously hired for discreet services. Peter appeared minutes later, a large, silent man who didn't ask questions. Isabel said coldly, "There's a woman in the back seat. I want you to lock her in the most isolated room in this building. Nobody can know she's here." Peter carried Eleanor into the abandoned nursing home, climbing creaking stairs to the second floor. He placed her in a small, empty room with just an old bed and a barred window. Isabel entered behind them, verifying that the door had a strong lock on the outside. She looked around the dirty, dark room, satisfied. Isabel turned to Peter and said with authority, "You will stand guard here. Bring her a little water and food once a day, the minimum necessary to keep her alive. But she cannot leave this room, cannot talk to anyone. If she tries to scream, you keep her quiet. Understood?" Peter nodded, accustomed to not questioning orders when the payment was good. Isabel put more money in his hands and said, "Remember, Peter, nobody can know she's here. If anyone finds out, both of us will have serious problems. Keep her locked up and silent. In a few days, everything will be resolved." Eleanor was lying on the old bed, unconscious, not knowing where she was or what had happened. Isabel looked at her one last time before leaving the room. She thought coldly, "Here you will wither away alone, old woman, in an isolated place with few resources, waiting for time to solve your problem." Isabel locked the door with a heavy padlock and went downstairs. She returned to her mansion, cleaned up any evidence that Eleanor had been there, and prepared her story. When Carol finally managed to leave her room a few hours later, Isabel calmly said she had sent the patient to a specialized hospital. Carol doubted it, but had no proof to question. 2 days later, Rick returned from his business trip exhausted but anxious. He barely waited for the taxi to completely stop before jumping out and rushing into the mansion. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, going straight to the guest room. But when he opened the door, the room was empty. The bed was made. All medical equipment had been removed, and there was no sign of Eleanor. Rick felt his heart race as he ran back to the stairs, shouting Isabel's name. He thought in panic, "Where is she? What happened?" Rick found Isabel in the living room, sitting elegantly on the sofa with a cup of tea in her hands. When she looked at him, there were tears in her eyes, perfectly calculated tears. Isabel set the cup aside and stood up, walking to Rick with slow steps. She held his hands and said with a trembling voice full of false emotion, "Rick, love, I'm so sorry. Something terrible happened while you were away. On the first night, she had a crisis. She woke up confused and agitated." Before anyone could stop her, she left the room, went downstairs, and fled the house. She was wearing only a thin robe. Carol and I searched everywhere. We went through the entire neighborhood calling her name, but she simply disappeared into the darkness. Rick felt as if he had been hit in the chest. He pulled his hands from Isabel's and said loudly, "How did you let this happen? Where was the nurse? Why wasn't anyone watching her?" Isabel let more tears roll down her face, her performance award-worthy. She answered with a broken voice, "I had given Karen time off because I was personally taking care of her. I never imagined she would have the strength to get up and run away. We've called the police. They're searching. But Rick..." It's been 2 days. An elderly, fragile woman without medication on the streets. The chances of finding her alive are... Rick didn't wait for her to finish. He grabbed the car keys and ran to the door. Isabel followed him, calling his name, but he completely ignored her. Rick got into the car and drove away at high speed, his mind in complete turmoil. He shouted inside the empty car, "Mom, where are you? I need to find you. I can't lose you again." He drove through the neighborhood streets, then throughout the entire city, desperately looking for any sign of Eleanor. He stopped at hospitals, police stations, homeless shelters. He showed the yellowed photo to everyone he met, asking if anyone had seen an elderly woman with white hair. But nobody had seen anything. Eleanor had simply disappeared. Rick continued searching until dawn, until exhaustion finally forced him to return home. When he entered the mansion, Isabel was waiting awake. She hugged him and said with false compassion, "Love, you need to accept. She's gone. Maybe it's better this way." But Rick pushed Isabel away and went up to his room. He locked the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and buried his face in his hands. Tears of frustration and despair rolled down his face. Rick thought in anguish, "She said she was my mother, looked into my eyes and called me son. And now she's missing, alone, dying somewhere. And I can't do anything. 3 days had passed since Eleanor's disappearance, and Rick had barely slept or eaten during this time. He spent nights driving through the city streets, searching on every corner, in every dark alley, in every square where homeless people usually took shelter. During the day, he called hospitals, police stations, and medical institutes, always with the same desperate question about an elderly woman with white hair who might have been found. But the answers were always negative, always empty of hope. Rick was sitting in his office that Friday morning, looking at the yellowed photograph he now kept on his desk, when he heard a hesitant knock on the door. He raised his tired eyes and saw Carol standing in the doorway, her hands nervously twisting the apron she wore. She seemed to have aged 10 years in the past few days, her face marked by worry and insomnia. Rick thought tiredly, "Carol is also suffering from this. We all are." Carol entered the office with slow steps, carefully closing the door behind her. She looked around as if checking if anyone else was nearby before walking to Rick's desk. Her hands visibly trembled as she took something out of her apron pocket, a small worn notebook with yellowed pages. Rick observed her with growing curiosity, noticing the tension in her every movement. Carol placed the notebook on the desk and said in a low but firm voice, each word costing her a visible effort, "Mr. Rick, forgive me for taking so long to speak. I'm very afraid of what might happen to me after this, but I can no longer stay silent, knowing that an innocent woman might be dying because of my cowardice. I need to tell the truth about what I saw, about what your wife Isabel has been doing." Rick straightened up in his chair immediately, his attention now completely focused on Carol. He felt his heart racing as he picked up the notebook and began to leaf through it. The pages were full of careful notes with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of events. Carol remained standing on the other side of the desk, her hands still trembling as she began to speak. She said with an increasingly firm voice as she gained courage, "A week ago I began to suspect Mrs. Isabel. She would frequently dismiss Nurse Karen and stay alone in the room with the patient. One day, I entered the room after she left and saw many used syringes in the medical waste, more than would be normal. I began to note everything strange that I saw. The times Isabel administered injections in secret, the times the poor lady tried to speak and became increasingly confused after Isabel gave her medicine." Rick felt his breathing become more difficult as he read Carol's notes. Each entry in the notebook was like a piece of a macabre puzzle fitting together. Dates and times when Isabel entered and left the room, descriptions of how Eleanor became increasingly sleepy and confused after Isabel's visits, notes about syringes and medication vials that Carol had seen. But it was the last entry, dated 3 days ago, that made Rick's blood freeze in his veins. Carol had written that she followed Isabel's car on the morning Eleanor disappeared. Rick raised his eyes from the notebook and stared at Carol. He said with a trembling voice, "You followed Isabel? Where did she go? Where is this woman now?" Carol took a deep breath, but her courage began to falter. She knew that if she said the exact address there in front of Rick, Isabel might find out and do something terrible before anyone could reach the location. She also feared that Isabel might be listening behind the door at that exact moment. Carol said with a low and hesitant voice, "She took the lady to a distant place, abandoned, far from the city. I followed the car, noted everything down, but Mr. Rick, I'm afraid to say more now. If Mrs. Isabel discovers that I told you, she might move the patient to another place or worse. I need to think about how to do this the right way, so that the lady can be saved." Rick felt frustration growing inside him. He rose from his chair and firmly held Carol's shoulders. Rick said with a loud and desperate voice, "Carol, for God's sake, if you know where she is, you need to tell me now. Every minute counts. This woman could be dying while we talk. Please tell me where Isabel took her." Before Carol could respond, the office door opened violently. Isabel entered, her eyes immediately focusing on the open notebook on Rick's desk. Her face paled for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. She looked from Rick to Carol and back to Rick, her mind working quickly to assess how much they had discussed. Isabel walked up to Rick and tried to grab the notebook, but he quickly moved it away. Isabel said with a controlled voice but with a hint of desperation, "Rick, what's happening here? Why is Carol in your office with the door closed?" Rick held the notebook in the air, his hands still trembling with anger and shock. He stared at his wife, really looking at her perhaps for the first time in years, seeing beyond the beautiful mask she always wore. Rick said with a harsh and accusing voice, "Carol told me everything, Isabel. About the drugs you gave to Eleanor, about the hidden syringes, about how you took her somewhere 3 days ago. She has everything noted down here, dates, times, everything. How could you do this? If that woman really is my mother as she claimed to be, if you kept her prisoner, if you lied to me all this time, I swear that." Isabel didn't let him finish. She assumed an expression of shock and profound sadness, tears instantly springing to her eyes as if triggered by a switch. She looked at Carol with a perfectly rehearsed mixture of hurt and disappointment. Isabel said with a trembling and hurt voice, "Carol, how can you do this? After all these years working in this house, after everything we've done for you, you make up these horrible lies about me. I know you never fully accepted me as Rick's wife. I know you still had loyalty to his mother, but this is pure cruelty. Inventing stories about drugs and kidnapping just because you don't like me." Carol stepped forward, her voice coming out louder and firmer than before. She pointed at Isabel and said with absolute conviction, "I'm not making up anything. I saw you injecting that poor woman when you thought no one was watching. I saw the syringes in the trash, and I followed your car to an abandoned place. I have everything documented. Mr. Rick can verify if I'm telling the truth." Isabel turned to Rick, holding his hands tightly. Her voice came out soft but firm, each word carefully chosen to plant doubt. Isabel said, looking deeply into his eyes, "Rick, love, think rationally for a moment. Carol is making up an absurd story. She says she saw me taking a woman somewhere, but where is the real evidence? She has notes in a notebook that she wrote herself, but that doesn't prove anything. She could have made it all up. And why would she wait 3 days to tell if she really saw something so serious? It doesn't make sense, love. She's lying because she wants to separate us, wants to destroy our marriage. She's always been jealous of our relationship." Rick was divided, his heart and mind in total war. Part of him wanted to believe Isabel, his wife of years, but another part saw the logic in Carol's words, saw the specificity of the details. Isabel noticed his hesitation and decided to force a choice. She released Rick's hands and took a step back, her posture becoming rigid and proud. Isabel said with a cold and ultimative voice, "Rick, you need to choose now. Either you believe this envious maid and her ridiculous lies, or you believe me, your wife. If you choose to believe her, then I can no longer stay in this house. I won't live in a place where I'm accused of terrible things without any real proof. So make your choice now. Either Carol leaves immediately or I leave." Rick looked from Isabel to Carol, his face showing all the anguish of the impossible decision. Isabel pressed harder, seeing that Rick was about to give in. She walked to the door and put her hand on the doorknob. Isabel said with a theatrically hurt voice, "I see you're hesitating, Rick. I see you're really considering believing her instead of me. This tells me everything I need to know about our marriage. I'm going to the bedroom to pack my bags. When you've made your decision, let me know." Rick felt the weight of crushing pressure falling on him. He looked again at the notebook in his hands, at Carol's notes. But then he looked at Isabel, at the woman he had married. His exhaustion from 3 days without proper sleep, his mental confusion, everything conspired against his ability to think clearly. Rick finally said with a tired and defeated voice, "Carol, I need you to leave. Get your things and leave the mansion today. I'm sorry, but I can't risk my marriage based on suspicions without concrete evidence." Carol felt as if she had taken a blow to the chest. She looked at Rick with eyes full of disappointment and deep sadness, but she nodded slowly, understanding that she had done everything she could. Carol said with a low but firm voice, "I understand, Mr. Rick. I'll get my things now. May God enlighten you to find the truth." Isabel went up the stairs with a satisfied smile hidden on her face, feeling that she had won another battle. Rick remained in his office, burying his face in his hands, wondering if he had made the right decision. Carol went to her small room on the ground floor and began packing her few possessions in an old suitcase. Silent tears rolled down her face as she folded her simple clothes. She thought sadly, he didn't believe me, but maybe there's still a way to save her. 20 minutes later, Carol came down the stairs, carrying her suitcase. Rick was still locked in his office, and Isabel was in her room upstairs. Carol walked slowly through the entrance hall, looking one last time at the house where she had worked for so many years. For it was then that she saw Rick's jacket, hanging on the coat rack near the front door. He always left his jackets there when he arrived from work. Carol looked around quickly, making sure she was completely alone. Then, with quick and silent movements, she took a piece of paper and a pen from her purse. Carol wrote rapidly, her handwriting trembling a little from the rush and emotion. She knew this was her last chance to save that poor woman. If Rick found the note when he put on his jacket, perhaps there would still be time. Carol folded the paper carefully and approached the coat rack. She checked once more that no one was watching before slipping her hand into the inner pocket of Rick's jacket, hiding the note deep inside where he would certainly find it when he put on his coat. Carol stepped back, picked up her suitcase again and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked back one last time at the stairs leading to the upper floor, at the hallway leading to Rick's office. She whispered so quietly that only she herself could hear, "May God guide you to your mother, Mr. Rick. May he open your eyes before it's too late." Carol opened the door and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. The door closed behind her with a soft and final click. In the inner pocket of Rick's jacket, the note waited to be discovered. On it was written in Carol's careful handwriting, "Abandoned asylum on the old road, kilometer 47. Your mother is there. Go get her today. She doesn't have much time. Isabel has locked her up and is letting her die. Please believe me. Forgive me for not being braver before. May God protect you. Carol." The morning of the next day arrived grey and cold, with heavy clouds covering the sky and threatening rain at any moment. Rick had spent another sleepless night, lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning endlessly between Carol's accusations and Isabel's denials. He couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor's face when she had said she was his mother, the absolute conviction in her eyes in that moment of lucidity. He also couldn't forget Carol's genuine tears when she left, the deep sadness in her voice as she said goodbye. When the first weak rays of sunlight came through the window, Rick gave up trying to sleep and got up. He took a quick shower, put on jeans and a simple shirt, and went downstairs quietly so as not to wake Isabel. Rick thought tiredly, "I need to do something. I can't stay here without acting while she might be in danger." Rick entered his office and picked up the car keys from the desk. He had decided to spend the entire day searching for Eleanor again, visiting every hospital, every police station, every shelter he hadn't yet checked. It was a small hope, almost non-existent, but it was all he had. As he grabbed the keys, his eyes fell on his jacket hanging on the back of the chair. He had left it there the night before after coming home. Rick picked up the jacket and began to put it on, preparing to leave. That's when he felt something strange in the inner pocket, a small bulk that shouldn't be there. He reached into the pocket and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. Rick frowned, confused, and opened the paper. He thought intrigued, "What is this? Where did this note come from?" The handwriting was Carol's. He recognized it immediately. Rick began to read and felt his heart completely stop when his eyes absorbed the words written there. The address was clear and specific, kilometer 47 of the old road, an abandoned asylum. Carol had left this for him, her last attempt to save Eleanor even after being fired and humiliated. Rick read the note 3 times, his hands trembling more with each reading. Carol's words echoed in his mind with increasing force. Isabel had locked his mother in an abandoned asylum. Isabel was letting her die. Isabel had lied about everything. Rick crumpled the note in his hand and said aloud to the empty office, "Carol was telling the truth. My God, she was telling the truth all along and I didn't believe her." Rick wasted no time. He put the note in his pocket, grabbed the car keys, and ran out of the mansion without looking back. He didn't say anything to Isabel, didn't leave any message, simply got into his car and drove away at high speed. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white as he drove through the still, empty morning streets. He took the road leading out of town, passing through increasingly spaced neighborhoods until buildings began to thin out and give way to vacant lots and vegetation. Rick constantly looked at the kilometer marker on the road, his heart beating faster with each kilometer that passed. When he finally saw the sign indicating kilometer 47, he slowed down and began looking for some abandoned building. Rick thought desperately, "It has to be here. Please let Carol be right about the place." That's when he saw it, a few meters ahead, hidden behind dense vegetation and old trees. A two-story building with peeling walls and broken windows, clearly abandoned for years. A faded sign hanging crookedly in front showed the barely visible words, "St. Joseph's Asylum." Rick quickly parked the car on the side of the road and ran toward the building. His feet hit the ground of dirt and stones hard as he approached the main entrance. The front door was ajar, creaking slightly with the wind. Rick was about to enter when a large, muscular man appeared, blocking the entrance. It was Peter, the watchman Isabel had hired. He looked at Rick with a neutral expression and said, "This building is private property. You cannot enter here." Rick paused for a second, studying the man in front of him. Peter was bigger and probably stronger, but Rick had something the watchman didn't have: absolute desperation and determination of a son looking for his mother. Rick stepped forward and said with a firm, authoritative voice, "I'm looking for an elderly woman who was brought here a few days ago. White hair, very weak. I know she's here, and I'm going in to get her, with or without your permission. So I suggest you get out of the way before I call the police, and we all have very serious problems." Peter hesitated, clearly not expecting to be confronted like this. Isabel had paid him well to keep Eleanor locked up and hidden, but she hadn't mentioned anything about what to do if someone showed up looking. Rick took advantage of the hesitation and pushed Peter aside forcefully, passing by him and entering the abandoned building. Peter tried to hold him, but Rick was already inside, running down the dark and dusty corridor. He shouted with all the strength of his lungs, "Mom, Eleanor, where are you? It's me, Rick. I'm here to save you." Rick climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor, opening doors to empty rooms one by one. Most were completely empty, with only trash and broken furniture scattered across the floor. He continued searching, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. It was in the fifth room that he tried to open the door and discovered it was locked from the outside with a heavy padlock. Rick felt a wave of hope and terror at the same time. He knocked on the door and shouted, "Is anyone in there?" "Mom, is that you?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, so weak he almost didn't hear it, came a voice from the other side of the door, a voice Rick had known since birth, a voice he hadn't heard in 5 long years. Eleanor said in an extremely weak voice, "Rick, my son, is it really you?" Rick felt tears burst from his eyes as he grabbed the doorknob and pulled with all his might. The padlock held firm, but the old wood around it began to crack. Rick stepped back a few paces and kicked the door with all the strength he had, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th kick, the wood around the padlock gave way completely and the door flew open with a bang. Rick rushed into the room and stopped immediately, shock taking over him. Eleanor was lying in a bed covered only with a thin sheet. She looked fragile and tired, her years on the streets clearly visible on her face. But her eyes were open and lucid, looking at Rick with a mixture of relief and love that broke his heart. Rick ran to the bed and fell to his knees beside her. He said, crying, "Mom, my mom, I finally found you. Everything's okay now. I'm going to get you out of here." Eleanor raised a trembling hand and touched Rick's face, her cold and weak fingers tracing the lines of his face as if memorizing every detail. Tears rolled from her eyes as she looked at the son she hadn't seen in 5 years. Eleanor said with a voice weak but full of emotion, "My little prince, you've grown so much. I thought I would never see your face again. Thought I would die here alone without being able to tell you the truth about everything that happened. About what Isabel did to me." Rick held her hand carefully, feeling how cold and fragile it was. He could see that she was very ill, probably with a high fever and severe dehydration, but she was alive, she was conscious, and could finally tell the truth. Rick said urgently, "Mom, I need to know everything. What did Isabel do? How did you end up living on the streets? Why did everyone think you were dead? Tell me everything, please." Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering strength to tell the story she had kept for so long. She began to speak slowly, pausing occasionally to cough or catch her breath. Eleanor said in a weak but clear voice, "5 years ago, I discovered that Isabel was stealing money from the family business. I was responsible for the accounting books at that time, remember? I started noticing discrepancies, money disappearing, strange transfers. It took me months of investigation until I was absolutely certain. When I finally confronted Isabel with the evidence, she was too calm, too cold. She said we would discuss it calmly. That night, she offered me tea. I drank it, trusting her as I always had. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Rick listened in absolute silence, his hands squeezing Eleanor's as she continued. Eleanor coughed again before proceeding. I woke up in a place I didn't recognize, a completely different city. I was on a dirty street, dressed in clothes that weren't mine, with no documents, no money, nothing. And worst of all, Rick, I didn't know who I was. My memory was completely erased. Isabel had given me drugs that wiped everything. Every memory, every name, every face. I didn't remember you, I didn't remember my life, I didn't remember anything. I spent 5 years living on the streets like a crazy beggar, not knowing I had a son looking for me, not knowing I had a life waiting for me. Rick's tears were falling freely now, wetting both his and Eleanor's hands. The pain of imagining his mother lost and alone for 5 years was almost unbearable. Rick said in a broken voice, "How did you recover your memory? How did you remember who you were?" Eleanor gave a weak, sad smile. She answered, "Gradually, very slowly, fragments began to return. A familiar face in a dream, a name that sounded familiar, a song I knew how to sing without knowing how I learned it. It took years, Rick, years of daily struggle to recover pieces of who I had been. And then, a few weeks ago, everything came back at once. I remembered you, your face as a child, the words I used to say to you every night. I remembered the house, the company, Isabel, and what she had done. I started looking for you, asking around on the streets, trying to find my way back. And then that car hit me on that rainy night, right on the street where you were passing by. I think God wanted us to find each other again." Rick embraced Eleanor with great care not to hurt her, his body shaking with sobs. He finally understood everything, finally saw Isabel for what she truly was. A cold and calculating criminal who had destroyed his mother's life to hide her crimes. Rick pulled back and looked into Eleanor's eyes. He said with determination, "I'm going to get you out of here now. I'm going to take you to the hospital. I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to make Isabel pay for everything she did. She won't get away with this, Mom, I promise." Rick put his arms under Eleanor's fragile body and lifted her from the bed with utmost care. She was so light she seemed to weigh nothing, her body consumed by years of malnutrition and the last few days without proper food or water. Eleanor rested her head on Rick's shoulder, finally allowing herself to relax after so long fighting alone. Rick walked toward the bedroom door, carrying his mother in his arms. He thought with growing anger, "Isabel will pay dearly for this. I'll make sure she spends the rest of her life paying for what she did." Rick was about to leave the room when he heard quick footsteps coming up the stairs. He stopped immediately, all his muscles tensing. The footsteps approached down the hallway, more than one person by the sound. Rick held Eleanor more tightly against his chest, turning to face whoever was coming. The bedroom door, already damaged from Rick's kick, was pushed roughly and opened completely. And there, standing at the entrance with the watchman, Peter, right behind her, was Isabel. She was elegantly dressed as always, but there was something different about her face. The mask of kindness and concern had completely fallen. Her eyes were cold and hard as stones, her mouth a thin line of contained rage. Isabel looked from Rick to Eleanor in his arms, and then back to Rick. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence in the room was heavy and tense, loaded with years of lies, betrayal, and pain. Rick could feel Eleanor trembling in his arms, her weak body reacting with fear to the presence of the woman who had destroyed her life. Rick held his mother tighter, his arms squeezing her protectively. He thought in fury, "She will never touch her again. I will protect my mother even if it cost me my life." Isabel took a step into the room, her high heels echoing on the old wooden floor. Her eyes never left Rick as she slowly entered. Peter remained at the door, blocking the only exit. Isabel finally broke the silence, her voice coming out low and dangerous. "Rick, what a surprise to find you here. It seems that nosy old Carol managed to pass her message before leaving. How inconvenient." Rick didn't respond, just held Eleanor tighter. His eyes met Isabel's cold ones, and for the first time in their years of marriage, he saw his wife for what she truly was. A beautiful monster hidden behind a perfect smile. Rick said with a firm voice full of hatred, "It's over, Isabel. I know everything now. I know what you did 5 years ago. I know about the theft, about the drugs, about everything. I'm leaving here with my mother and going straight to the police. You will pay for every second of suffering you caused her." Isabel gave a low and bitter laugh without any humor. She crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly, studying Rick like a predator studies its prey. Her eyes shone with something dangerous and unstable. Isabel said calmly, "You really think I'll let you leave here and ruin everything I've built? After all I did to keep that old woman hidden? You've always been so naive, Rick, so trusting, so easy to manipulate, and now look where your stupid kindness has brought you." The tense silence in the abandoned room was broken by Isabel's cold voice. She took another step toward Rick and Eleanor, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and barely contained desperation. Isabel said with an icy voice but trembling slightly, "Rick, I didn't want you to find out like this. I had everything planned differently. She was simply supposed to disappear, wither away here alone until her weak body gave up. And you would never know the truth. You would continue loving me, trusting me, living our perfect life. But you had to be stubborn, had to believe that nosy maid. Now we're all here in this horrible place and everything is falling apart." Rick felt a fury growing inside him like he had never felt before. He took a step toward Isabel, still carefully holding Eleanor in his arms. His voice came out loud and full of indignation when he said, "You're crazy if you think you'll get away with this. I'm leaving now with my mother and we're going straight to the police. I'll tell everything you did, the theft, the kidnapping, the drugs, everything. You'll spend the rest of your miserable life in prison, paying for every second of suffering you caused her. Get out of the way, Isabel, now." Isabel saw the determination in Rick's eyes and realized that she had completely lost control of the situation. Panic began to take over her, and her carefully constructed composure began to crack. She started speaking rapidly, her words coming out rushed and nervous, trying to justify herself in a desperate way. Isabel said with an increasingly loud and unstable voice, "You don't understand, Rick. She found out I was taking money from the company, just a little, just enough to have the life I deserve, and she was going to report me, throw me out on the street like I was nothing. She was going to destroy everything I built. I had to do this, I had no choice. I drugged her, yes, I forged the death documents, yes, I kept her away without memory, yes. But I did it all for us, Rick, for our life together, for our future. She was going to ruin everything." Rick looked at Isabel with absolute disgust. How had he been so blind for so many years? How had he not seen the monster that slept beside him every night? He was about to respond when he heard the sound of sirens approaching from outside the abandoned building. Everyone in the room stood motionless, listening to the sound grow louder until it finally stopped right in front of the asylum. Car doors slammed outside and male voices shouted orders. Rick felt a wave of relief and hope. He thought, "The police are here. Thank God the police have arrived." Heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs, and 2 detectives appeared in the hallway, their weapons in hand but pointed downward. They quickly surveyed the scene before them, Rick holding a visibly ill elderly woman, Isabel standing in the middle of the room with a panicked expression, and Peter blocking the door. One of the detectives, a middle-aged man with graying hair, stepped forward and showed his identification. He said with an authoritative voice, "Police! Nobody move! We received a formal complaint yesterday about kidnapping and assault at this location. Mrs. Isabel, you are being investigated for serious crimes. I need everyone to cooperate and remain calm while we clarify the situation." Isabel looked from the detectives to Rick and back to the detectives. Her face paled when she realized that everything was lost, that there was no turning back. Carol had gone to the police, had delivered her evidence, and now the detectives were there to arrest her. Total panic took over Isabel. Without thinking, acting only on survival instinct, she turned and pushed Peter with all her strength, catching him by surprise. Peter stumbled sideways, and Isabel rushed past him toward the stairs. The detectives shouted for her to stop, but Isabel was already descending the stairs at a dangerous speed, her high heels hitting hard on the old wooden steps. She thought desperately, "I need to escape. I need to get out of here before they arrest me." Isabel ran through the first-floor corridor and out the main door of the asylum. Her car was parked a few meters away, and she ran toward it as if her life depended on it. The detectives came running after her, shouting for her to stop immediately, but Isabel heard nothing beyond the sound of her own heart beating desperately. She got into the car, started the ignition with violently trembling hands, and floored the accelerator. The car sped off, raising dust and stones, and entered the old road with screeching tires. The detectives ran back to their vehicles and immediately initiated the pursuit, their sirens exploding in loud sound that echoed through the abandoned area. Rick exited the building still carrying Eleanor, watching the scene unfold before him. He saw Isabel's car accelerate down the road with police cars right behind. Isabel's car was at a speed too dangerous for that winding road. Rick whispered, "She's going to kill herself driving like that. Or kill someone." Isabel constantly looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the blue and red lights of the police cars approaching. Sweat ran down her face, smearing her perfect makeup. She accelerated even more, trying to gain distance from the police. The road ahead made a sharp curve to the left, but Isabel was going too fast to notice in time. When she finally saw the curve, she slammed on the brakes and turned the steering wheel sharply. But it was too late. The car completely lost its grip on the asphalt. Isabel felt the vehicle begin to roll over, and everything became a blur of movement and sound. The car rolled once, twice before finally stopping on the side of the road, wheels up, broken glass scattered everywhere. Isabel thought dazedly, "I'm alive. I'm still alive." The police officers stopped their vehicles and ran to the overturned car. Isabel managed to crawl out of the vehicle through the broken window, her entire body aching but with apparently nothing broken. Her face was injured, her expensive dress torn and dirty with soil. She tried to stand and run again, but her legs failed, and she fell to her knees on the ground. The detectives reached her in seconds, and one of them firmly held her arms while the other took out the handcuffs. Isabel screamed and tried to struggle. "Let me go! You don't understand. I had no choice. She was the one who forced me to do this." But the detectives paid no attention to her words. With professional and efficient movements, they handcuffed Isabel and lifted her from the ground. One of them began reading her rights while they led her to the police car. Isabel looked back and saw Rick still standing in front of the abandoned asylum, holding Eleanor in his arms. Their eyes met for one last moment. Rick looked at her with a mixture of disgust, sadness, and relief. Isabel was placed in the back seat of the police car, the cold handcuffs biting into her wrists. She thought bitterly, "I lost everything. My perfect life, my mansion, my husband. It's all over." Rick urgently asked the other police officers to call an ambulance for Eleanor. She was growing weaker in his arms, her breathing shallow and rapid, her body burning with fever. One of the officers made the call immediately, and in 15 minutes an ambulance arrived at the scene. The paramedics placed Eleanor on a stretcher with great care, connected oxygen and IV, and quickly took her into the ambulance. Rick climbed in with her, holding his mother's hand during the entire journey to the hospital. He thought in silent plea, "Please hold on. You survived 5 years of hell. You can't give up now." The ambulance arrived at the hospital in record time, and Eleanor was immediately taken to the emergency room. Rick tried to follow, but the nurses gently prevented him, saying the doctors needed to work without interference. He was led to a waiting room in the hallway, the same hallway where everything had begun weeks ago, when he brought that unknown homeless woman after the hit and run. Rick sat in a plastic chair, buried his face in his hands, and finally allowed all the emotions he had suppressed to surface. Tears rolled between his fingers as he cried silently, releasing years of grief, weeks of confusion, and hours of terror. He thought between sobs, "I found my mother, finally found her. But is there still time?" The hours dragged on like eternities. Rick didn't eat, didn't drink, just sat in that chair waiting for news. Other patients and visitors came and went through the hallway, but he barely noticed them. All that existed in his world was that emergency room door and his mother fighting for her life on the other side. Finally, after what seemed like days but was only 5 hours, the door opened and a doctor came out. He was a young man with a tired appearance, wearing a white coat stained with sweat. Rick jumped up, running to the doctor with his heart in his throat. He said desperately, "Doctor, my mother, how is she? Please tell me she will survive." The doctor looked at Rick with a grave and tired expression. He removed the surgical mask covering his face and took a deep breath before speaking. The doctor said with a serious and cautious voice, "We managed to stabilize her for now, sir. But I need to be honest with you. Your mother is very debilitated. Her body had suffered, but now it's receiving the necessary care to recover. Additionally, she has a heart condition that was aggravated by the lack of medication and recent traumas. We've done everything we could for the moment, administered fluids, medications, stabilized her vital signs. But the next 24 hours will be critical. Her body will have to fight hard to recover. We'll monitor her constantly, but I cannot make promises, sir. The situation is very delicate." Rick felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. He staggered backward and had to lean against the wall to avoid falling. After everything they had been through, after finally reuniting, his mother could still die. The injustice of it all was too much to bear. Rick looked at the doctor with pleading eyes. "Can I see her? Can I stay by her side?" The doctor nodded slowly and said, "Yes, you can see her. In fact, I recommend that you stay. Sometimes the presence of loved ones can make a difference in cases like this. But I need you to be prepared for what you'll see. She's connected to many machines, many tubes. It can be difficult to see. I'll take you to her now." Rick followed the doctor down a long corridor to an intensive care unit. And there, in a bed surrounded by medical equipment, was his mother. Eleanor had her eyes closed, her face as pale as paper, tubes and wires connected to her fragile body. But she was alive, still breathing, still fighting. Rick thought with determination, "I'll stay here by your side every second. I won't leave you alone ever again." 3 weeks passed since that critical night at the hospital, and the miracle Rick had prayed for finally happened. Eleanor survived. During the first 48 hours, the doctors weren't sure if she would make it, but Eleanor was strong, stronger than anyone imagined. Day by day, slowly, her body began responding to treatments. The fever subsided, nutrient levels in her blood began to normalize, and her strength gradually returned. Rick didn't leave her side for a moment during those crucial days. He slept in a chair beside the bed, ate quick meals brought by nurses, and spent every minute holding his mother's hand. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes completely for the first time, lucid and smiling weakly at him, Rick cried tears of pure joy. He thought with gratitude, "She's going to be all right. My mother is going to survive." During the weeks of recovery at the hospital, mother and son spent hours talking, filling in the empty 5 years that had been stolen from them. Eleanor told stories of her days on the streets, cold nights sleeping in squares, the occasional kindness of strangers who gave her food or blankets. She talked about the moments when her memory started coming back, fragment by fragment, like a puzzle being slowly assembled. Rick listened to every word with complete attention, sometimes laughing at the funny stories, sometimes crying when she described the most difficult moments. He held her hand and said with a voice full of remorse, "Mom, forgive me for not having suspected Isabel earlier. Forgive me for believing her when Carol tried to warn me. If I had been smarter, you wouldn't have suffered so much." Eleanor squeezed Rick's hand firmly and shook her head firmly. Eleanor said with a soft but firm voice, "No, my son. You have nothing to apologize for. Isabel was a professional liar, a consummate actress. The fault is all hers, Rick. All hers and no one else's. You saved me. When you could have given up, when you could have believed I was just a crazy homeless woman, you kept searching for the truth. You found me, rescued me, and gave me back my life. There's nothing to forgive, my little prince. There's only gratitude and love in my heart." During this time in the hospital, Rick had also dealt with legal matters. He hired the best lawyers and initiated the processes to annul the marriage and recover the stolen assets. The lawyers worked quickly, using Isabel's confessions and the evidence collected by Carol to track every penny that had been diverted from the family business. Bank accounts were frozen, properties were seized, and slowly the money began to be recovered. Rick thought with satisfaction, "Isabel won't keep anything she stole." Finally, after 3 weeks of intensive treatment, the doctors discharged Eleanor. Rick prepared everything carefully. He had immediately rehired Carol, offering profound apologies for not believing her when she tried to warn him. Carol, with her generous heart, forgave him instantly and returned to the mansion with joy. She spent days preparing Eleanor's room, filling it with fresh flowers and ensuring everything was perfect. On the day Rick brought Eleanor home, Carol had prepared a small celebration in the mansion's garden. Nothing too elaborate, just some simple decorations and a homemade cake. Rick hugged Carol and said, "Thank you for never giving up on the truth. I saved my mother with your courage." When Rick's car entered through the mansion gate, Eleanor looked out the window and felt tears fill her eyes. It was her home, the place where she had raised Rick, where she had lived so many happy moments before Isabel destroyed everything. Rick helped Eleanor carefully out of the car, offering his arm for support as she walked slowly. Carol was waiting at the door, her own tears running down her face as she saw Eleanor alive and back. They embraced, two women who had survived Isabel's cruel games. Carol said with a choked voice, "Welcome back home, Mrs. Eleanor. This house was empty without you." Rick guided Eleanor to the back garden, where Carol had set up a small table with tea, cake, and flowers. The afternoon sun shone softly, making the garden flowers shine with vibrant colors. Eleanor sat in a comfortable chair, and Rick sat beside her, holding her hand. Carol served tea for both and then discreetly withdrew to give them privacy. Mother and son sat in comfortable silence, just appreciating the moment, the peace, the feeling of finally being safe and together. There was no more Isabel to destroy their happiness, no more lies poisoning their lives. Rick thought peacefully, "Finally I can breathe. My mother is here, she's safe." They talked for hours as the sun slowly moved across the sky. Eleanor told more stories of her adventures on the streets, some sad, others surprisingly funny. Rick told about the last 5 years of his life, about how the business had grown but how he always felt empty inside. They laughed together, cried together, and slowly began the healing process that would take time but had finally begun. Rick spoke about the legal proceedings against Isabel, about how she would soon face trial. Eleanor listened in silence, her face showing satisfaction at knowing justice would be done. She thought, "Isabel will pay for everything." As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Eleanor grew quiet for a moment. There was something she needed to tell Rick, something important she had remembered during her weeks of recovery. She turned to him and saw how relaxed he looked for the first time in so long. Eleanor took a deep breath and squeezed Rick's hand. She said in a serious voice, "Rick, my son, there's something you need to know, something important." Rick turned completely toward her, his full attention focused on his mother. Eleanor continued, choosing her words carefully. "Before all this happened 5 years ago, when I began to discover Isabel's thefts, I didn't just sit waiting. I hired a private investigator, someone discreet who could track where the money was going. What I discovered was disturbing, Rick. Isabel wasn't working alone. There were other people involved, a small but organized network that helped her divert funds and hide the money. I had started to compile a complete dossier with names, evidence, everything. That's why she acted so quickly to eliminate me. I was too close to exposing the entire scheme." Rick felt his stomach tighten. He had thought that with Isabel arrested, everything would be resolved. But if there were other people involved, people who were still free, this meant potential danger. Rick asked, "Who else was involved, Mother? Do you remember the names?" Eleanor slowly shook her head and said, "Some I vaguely remember, but not enough to be certain. And here's the problem, Rick. Isabel knows I had that dossier. Now that she's imprisoned and knows she'll spend years in jail, she might try to use these people to get revenge on us. Desperate people do desperate things, my son. We need to be alert. We need to protect ourselves." Rick held both of Eleanor's hands and said firmly, "Mother, we'll face this together. I'll hire security for the house. I'll talk to my lawyers about investigating these other people. I won't let anyone hurt you again. Never again. We've been through hell and back. We won't let anything destroy our second chance." Eleanor smiled, her eyes filling with tears of pride. She caressed Rick's face and said, "My little prince has grown up and become my protector. Together we'll overcome anything, but for now in this moment let's just enjoy being together again. Life has given us a second chance and I won't waste it with fear. Let's live, my son." The women's prison was a cold and soulless place, with grey concrete walls and iron bars. Isabel was sitting in her small and cramped cell, sharing the space with 3 other women who looked at her with barely disguised contempt. She had spent the last 2 months there, awaiting trial, and each day was a new torture. The woman who once wore only designer clothes now wore a faded and stained orange uniform. Her hair, once always perfectly styled in expensive salons, was now uncut and lifeless. Isabel looked at her own hands and barely recognized the person she had become. She thought bitterly, "How did I reach this point? How did I lose everything?" That Thursday morning, Isabel was called to the visiting room. Her lawyer had arrived, a middle-aged man named Dr. Reynolds. Isabel walked through the prison corridors escorted by 2 guards, hearing the shouts and cruel laughter of the other inmates as she passed. Since they discovered she had stolen money and tried to kill an elderly woman, Isabel had become the target of constant humiliation. The other inmates pushed her, stole her food, and made her life a daily hell. Isabel thought angrily, "These criminals judging me." Isabel sat on the other side of a metal table. Dr. Reynolds was waiting, his folder open in front of him. He looked at Isabel, and she saw pity in his eyes. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Isabel, we need to talk about your case and about the trial that will take place next week. Unfortunately, the news is not good." Dr. Reynolds sighed and began to list. "The investigations were extremely thorough. They have solid evidence of everything. The complete bank records showing each illegal transfer, the fake documents that you forged declaring Eleanor's death, Carol's testimony, who documented everything, Peter's testimony, the watchman who made a deal, and the worst, the complete confession that you made when you confronted Rick at the nursing home. The detectives were outside listening to everything. There is no possible defense against your own confession." Isabel felt the blood drain from her face. Dr. Reynolds continued, "The prosecutors are asking for 25 years. The best estimate I can give is that you will get between 15 and 20 years in prison. You will leave as a middle-aged woman, without money, without reputation, without anything." In the following weeks, Isabel sank into deep depression. She barely ate, barely slept, spent her days lying down staring at the stained ceiling of her cell. The other inmates continued to torment her daily, whispering insults, throwing cold water on her while she slept, hiding her few possessions. Isabel had become a shadow of the proud woman she once was. Her eyes lost their sparkle, her body became even thinner. When the day of the trial came, Isabel was taken in handcuffs to the court. She entered the room and saw Rick sitting in the first row along with Eleanor. Mother and son were holding hands, looking at her with expressions that mixed justice and compassion. Isabel looked away, unable to face the people she had tried to destroy. She thought, "They won. I lost everything." The trial was quick and merciless. The prosecutors presented all the meticulously organized evidence. The recording of Isabel's confession was played for the entire room to hear, her own voice admitting every horrible crime she had committed. Carol testified with a firm voice, showing her notebook full of detailed notes. Peter testified, describing how Isabel hired him to keep Eleanor prisoner and how she paid him to keep her silent. The experts showed the bank records, each illegal transfer marked in red on the spreadsheets projected on the wall. Dr. Reynolds tried his best, arguing for mitigating circumstances that no one believed. But it was useless against the overwhelming weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with the verdict, guilty on all charges. Isabel heard the word repeated 4 times, 1 for each crime. She thought numbly, "It's over. It's really all over." The judge, an elderly man with a stern appearance and deep voice, looked at Isabel with clear disapproval in every line of his face. He adjusted his glasses and said with absolute authority, "Mrs. Isabel, the crimes you have committed are among the most serious this court has ever witnessed. You betrayed your family's trust, stole money that did not belong to you, and committed acts of extreme and calculated cruelty against a defenseless elderly woman who trusted you. You have shown no remorse, no repentance, only self-preservation. Therefore, considering the gravity of your actions and the prolonged suffering you caused the victim, I sentence you to 18 years in prison with closed regime for aggravated kidnapping, ideological falsification, aggravated misappropriation, and attempted qualified homicide. The guards led Isabel out of the courtroom, her heavy handcuffs creaking with each step. As she was taken through the main corridor, she turned her head and looked through the high window facing the street. And there, across the street, standing under a flowering tree that swayed gently in the wind, were Rick and Eleanor. They were embracing, smiling at each other with expressions of pure relief and happiness, free and at peace under the golden sunlight. Eleanor was dressed in beautiful and elegant clothes, her face showing the health and life she had regained in recent weeks. Rick had his protective arm around his mother's shoulders, his head inclined toward her in a gesture of infinite affection. The sight was too much for Isabel to bear, the image of that happiness she had tried to destroy, but which had survived despite all her efforts. She screamed with all the strength remaining in her lungs, "No, this isn't fair. I deserved that life. I deserved everything." But no one paid attention to her desperate cries. The guards pulled her more forcefully through the outer corridors to an armored van that was waiting for her. When she arrived back at her cell in the prison, the metal door closed behind her with a final and definitive sound that echoed in her soul. Isabel threw herself on her narrow, hard bed and cried until she had no more tears, until her throat hurt and her eyes burned. She thought in absolute despair, "I lost everything. My freedom, my luxury, my life, my future. Everything is gone." Meanwhile, across town, in the mansion that had now returned to being a true home filled with love, Rick and Eleanor were sitting in the garden as the sun slowly set, painting the sky with shades of orange, pink, and gold. Carol had prepared a special dinner to celebrate the end of the trial and the official beginning of a new life. They toasted with glasses of fruit juice, the liquid glowing under the soft light of the candles Carol had lit on the table. Rick raised his glass with a steady hand and eyes shining with emotion. "To justice, Mother, to truth that finally triumphed over lies, and to our new beginning together, to the years we still have ahead to recover everything that was stolen from us." Eleanor touched her glass to Rick's with a delicate sound of crystal, her own tears of joy flowing freely down her face. "To new beginnings, my dear son. To the years that were stolen, but which will not define or destroy us. Isabel chose the path of darkness, greed, and cruelty, and now she's paying the fair price for her choices. We chose light, we chose love, we chose truth and kindness, and for that, we are here, free, together, and finally, in deep peace." They drank slowly, savoring each sip as if it were the most precious nectar in the world. And as night fell gently over the garden, bringing with it the song of crickets and the perfume of night flowers, mother and son remained seated side by side, looking at the stars that began to appear one by one in the dark sky. There was no more fear hanging over their heads, no more lies poisoning every moment, no more Isabel to destroy their happiness. There was only true peace, unconditional love, and the sacred promise of many happy years together ahead. Karma had finally caught up with the villain with all its might, and the good had triumphed as they always should triumph. Did you enjoy Rick and Eleanor's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.